Today we're going to be making these gorgeous ruffled napkins. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, or welcome if you're new here. I'm Christine, and I am so excited to share today's project because I've been working to perfect these napkins for the last couple of weeks, and I just absolutely love the way they've turned out. So if you know me, you know I love ruffles. This is my Sullivan sweatshirt, which features ruffles. My Bleecker sweatshirt has narrower ruffles, and also my Essex dress has a nice bias cut ruffle on the sleeves. So I love ruffles, and I recently got my grandmother's holiday dishes. These are the Lennox holiday pattern. And I love them. Over the years, my mom has picked up a few other pieces. So I have a nice full set of these Christmas dishes. And I recently brought them home. And so I've been starting to think about like the tablescape. I also picked up this vintage linen. It's like a table cover for one of the small round tables. But look, it has the heart with a holly, a wreath, a reindeer. And I just have to show you the embroidery work that this sewist did. Look how beautiful the work is from the backside. It's just so fun to appreciate beautiful vintage linens. I know it's only April, but it's just one of those ideas that I couldn't get out of my head. And I figured since Easter is literally right around the corner, this would be a fun tutorial to share now. And I actually got this linen a long time ago at Joann's. It was about 3/4 of a yard. And when I bought it, I thought I was going to make a hacked Ludlow top out of it. I thought I had enough with the 3/4 yard because I just fell in love with the color. But as it turned out, it wasn't quite enough. And so this fabric has been sitting in my stash for a couple of years, and I was feeling a little bit bummed about it. There wasn't really enough to make something. But then when it came to my dishes, I was like, oh my gosh, I have that linen that's gonna be perfect for napkins. So I had originally seen these napkins at Zara some time ago, made of like a cream colored linen, and they were so beautiful. They stuck into my mind. So that's sort of where the inspiration for these has come from. They are rather time consuming to sew. I'm just gonna be totally upfront about that. It's not a super quick project, but because it's time consuming, it was really important to me that I figure out a way to make these really durable for the washing machine. So obviously napkins are going to be pretty, heavily used and washed. So the ones that I had seen at Zara, I believe were just serged. Like the ruffle was just serged, and then so this on the wrong side of the napkin was just a serged stitch and like folded over and top stitched. But even a serger stitch like that over several wears, being linen as well, it's going to show signs of wear, and I didn't want to do that. And so I've done this like a binding type of solution with some mitered corners. Let's see, this was still a test, so some of them are better than others. I did borrow some techniques from the quilters to do this, and I've also done a baby hem on the edge of the ruffle. So you can see there are some really nice details that do take a little bit of time. And then the top stitching, you can kind of see from the right side, that just finishes it off. So let me show you one of my samples that I did as I was trying to figure out how to do this project. So one of the things that you can choose when you do your own napkins is the width of your ruffle, and also how tightly gathered you'd like it. So this original one I did with a finished 1-inch ruffle, and I cut the ruffle fabric lengths double the size of my napkin. So you can see this one, the ruffles are they're really gathered. And you can see on my red one, they're a little bit flowier and looser, and obviously wider, and one layer. So I decided the double layer, like this one, was too heavy. So I went ahead with a single layer for the red. And I also perfected the mitered corner technique for behind with this sample. I also perfected, so this one, I had done the top stitching very wide away from the seam and I didn't like that as much. So I figured out a way to make the binding as narrow as possible so you get kind of just a little bit of a finer look with it. So first we need to cut all of our pieces. The napkin size that I chose is 16 inches square. And that is just the inner napkin part, not including the ruffle. So for whatever, you can make whatever size you want, but I'm going to be giving the measurements and everything for a 16-inch square base napkin. So you'll need to cut a 16-inch square, which I already I have here. So then for a 16-inch square napkin, if you want to do your ruffles, like I've done them on this sample, just a little bit, flowier, not as tight as this. This is, you'll need to cut your ruffles at 1.5 times the 16 inches of your napkin. So that means we're going to need 96 inches of ruffle fabric. And these, to get this exact look, I cut my strips at 3 inches wide. So you're going to need 96 inches long and 3 inches wide in order to get this type of a look. And the last thing we're going to need to cut is the little binding that goes on the back. And so we're going to need to cut our 1-inch strips of this. And you can just cut them as long as your fabric, as you can fit in your fabric. I did have to seam mine together a couple of times, which is no big deal. The other thing I'm going to show you is a technique borrowed from the quilters of how to end this. Let me see. Where is it? So we're going to end our binding in a super clean way. This is where I've attached my 2 ends of the binding when I've finished sewing it on, and it's so neat and tidy. So there's literally no raw seams in this entire napkin, which is going to make it super, super durable in the wash. So to get started sewing, the first thing I'm going to do is take my ruffle pieces. I actually have 2 because that's how I had to cut it according to my fabric. So I'm going to sew these 2 pieces together so they're completely in a round. And I'm actually going to use a French seam when I sew them together. So again, no raw edges, no serged edges even. So I'm going to sew my ruffle pieces into a round using French seams. Okay, so I've sewn my ruffle into one giant circle using the beautiful French seam. And the next thing I'm going to do is finish one of the long raw edges with a pseudo baby hem. So normally a traditional baby hem uses 3 rows of stitching, which for this amount of ruffle is a lot of stitching. So I've kind of done a pseudo baby hem. And the first thing I do is just fold under an 1/8 of an inch, or the least amount possible that I can. I'm just folding under on the raw edge, and then I'm just sewing kind of close to the raw edge, somewhere in the middle between the fold and the raw edge there. So I just had a brilliant idea as I was sewing this. I don't know why I didn't think of it before, but we could definitely be using our rolled hem foot on the sewing machine to do this, this edge finish. But it's too late for me now on this project, but I just wanted to share that. It's worth maybe doing a test of your own rolled hem foot to see if it makes it a little bit easier. So now that we have the first row of stitching sewn down, I'm just going to fold this over again on top of it and then top stitch. So this gives us that really nice, neat kind of pseudo baby hem. So I've completed the baby hem on the one raw edge of my ruffle. And the next thing I'm going to do is mark it into quarters, because I found that it's easier to do one line of gathering with thread tails on either end for each edge of the napkin. It makes the gathering a little bit faster. So I've quartered out my long piece. I've just marked pins on one, and I'm using my French seams for the other quarter point. So I have a full video on perfecting gathers. If you want to take a look at that, I'll drop it in one of the corners and in the description box below. But essentially what I'm going to do is sew 2 rows of gathering in order to create a really nice smooth, almost like a channel for me to stitch in. So I'm using 1/4 inch seam allowances. So I'm going to sew 1 line of gathering at 3/8 of an inch, so an 1/8 larger than my seam allowance, and 1/8 of an inch smaller than my seam allowance. So also the second row at an 1/8 of an inch. So, and then I will start and stop at my quarter points, pull out my thread tails, and then start sewing again. So I have a point to pull up the gathers at each quarter point. Okay, so I've finished adding the 2 lines of gathering stitches all along the other raw edge of my ruffle, and starting and stopping at each of my quarter points. So I have a lot of thread tails here. I've gone ahead and quartered out or marked kind of the halfway point on each of the edges of my square. And now what I'm going to be doing is just matching the quarter points of my ruffle to those halfway points on my main napkin square. So I'm just going to place my ruffle right sides together, and I'll just pin in these 4 points. This is going to give me a good start because we have a lot of gathering to do. So at least if I pin these 4 points in, I know I'm going to have an even ruffle, making sure that there's no twists in the ruffle as I pin it in. And now I'm going to start pulling up my bobbin threads. So you kind of have to kind of make sense of your threads here so that you pull up the right ones. And so I'm kind of separating these out, and then I'll just start pulling them up, and I just will keep gathering until all of my ruffle fits in this section. So I wanted to show you how I pin in my corners. So as I'm gathering up my ruffle to fit, I'm approaching the corner and I'm just giving it a little like pivoting and keeping it gathered so that when I sew, I'm going to be sewing down, and then I'll literally pivot at the corner and keep sewing. So you can see on my finished napkin, it's not like a really firm point there just because there is some bulk underneath it. But you can see we have enough ruffle to make the corner. So you definitely want to keep ruffling it all the way around the corner. So now I have my entire ruffle pinned, and I'm going to attach this ruffle to my napkin. So I'll do this by sewing a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm literally going to be sewing right down the center of those 2 gathering stitches that I just sewed in. And I've secured my gather threads by just kind of wrapping them around a pin. And as I get to each area, I'm just kind of taking my finger and just making sure that the gathering in this area, the transition area between the start-stop where I've started and stopped my gathers, that there are even gathers here so that it doesn't have like a flat area there. And so yeah, and then I just sew my 1/4 inch. And now I'm coming into my corner. I'm going to set my machine to have the needle down. So I'll be making a pivot here at the corner. So I'm just kind of like pulling the ruffle into the corner a bit to get it as perpendicular as possible so that I can make that pivot there. So just kind of pulling my ruffle in, giving myself a straight an area, and then I will stop right there and make my pivot. And I'm kind of making sure that the ruffle under here is not getting caught under this area. So just kind of getting it all aligned, and I'll just keep on sewing. So here you can see I've got one of those flat spots. So I'm going to grab my threads here and just make sure that I hold them tight. I'm going to wrap them actually around this pin and then kind of distribute these right up to the pin. There we go. That way this area is as gathered as possible. and I'll just remove the pin as I approach. Okay, so I have officially attached to the entire ruffle. We are done with the gathering. We are done with it. So I just kind of double checked just to make sure everything looks good. I have gone in and just trimmed some of my threads just to make it as neat as possible. And now we are ready to finish this seam. So we're going to cover the seam with our binding. So I've gone ahead and attached all of my 1-inch strips together. For the 16-inch napkin, you're going to want to have like 70 to 75 inches of binding. So it seems like a lot, but this is what it looks like. And again, it's 1 inch wide, not cut on the bias, because we're not going to be going around any corners here. So we really don't need any type of stretch. And actually, I kind of want it to be stable. And I've actually gone ahead and just folded under a 1/4 inch on one of the long raw edges all the way down. And now we're just going to sew this right sides down over our ruffle. So I don't actually pin this in to start. I just, I'm going to show you how we're going to do the corners and everything and the end point. So we're going to make this super, super clean, and then we're going to top stitch it down. So I'm going to meet you at the sewing machine. So I have my napkin ruffle side up. So this is actually the wrong side of my ruffle. And I'm going to take one end of my binding and start, give myself maybe 3-4 inches, and that's where I'm going to start. So I'm starting about halfway down one side of the napkin, and I'm placing my binding right side down. So this would actually be right side to the wrong side of my ruffle. And I will just kind of finger place that and then just slide it under my machine. And I'm going to place it at the 1/4 inch seam allowance line and just pop my presser foot down. So I'm going to just sew this on until I reach my corner, and then I'll show you how I've kind of figured out how to do the corner. Okay, so as I come into my corner, I'm just making sure that all my ruffle is free, that I'm not like getting it caught anywhere around here. So just be extra careful for your ruffle. I kind of tuck it in there, and I'm just paying attention to the corner point, just kind of getting that smoothed out. And so what I'm going to do is just take my little trimmers and 1/4 inch up from the edge of the corner, I'm just going to slice in just about 1/4 inch, just a little cut. And then this will allow me to then pivot my binding around the corner and have a nice edge there. So that cut forms a little box in the corner. I'm going to show you closer up as well. So I do have my machine set to the needle down position. So let's just do one. Just go right on into the corner, stop, and I'll pivot. And underneath here, just smoothing out my binding, and I'll just continue sewing down the way. Okay, so I'm going to get this as close as humanly possible so you can see what I've done. You can see I've made a 1/4 inch little nip at 1/4 inch from the edge of my napkin. And this allows me just to pivot. Let's see. I'm doing this one-handed, so then I stop my machine right there, right at the edge of that corner. So let me show you how it looks on the one we just did. You can see I've just done the little nip there, and then it actually kind of forms a square. And then you just pivot right at the top of that little nip that you made. And then once we're going to trim all of this, but then once you turn it, you can see like this, it's quite bulky at the moment, but then on the back, then we're just going to do a nice miter there, and then this will fold over and be nice and clean. So I'm just coming to the last several inches of attaching my binding. And I want to show you this technique that is borrowed from the quilters. So when you're doing the binding on a quilt, this is actually the technique that my mom taught me for how you finish it so it's just super clean. And I figured this is a great place to do this same technique. So all I'm going to do, I'm actually going to just trim this side so that it lays flat. So I'll just trim about there, just off of it. So this side lays nice and flat. And then I'm going to lay this side over that and just, make sure it's all nice and flat there. And then this little piece that I just clipped away, I'm going to use it as a guide for 1 inch wide. So however wide your binding is unfolded is how much we're going to measure as an overlap of our underbinding and our overbinding. So you can see, let's see, where does this one starts here. So I'll just kind of line up my 1 inch there, and then I'll overlap my over. And at this edge of the 1 inch, I'm going to cut this binding. So I should probably grab better scissors. So I am just overlapping my under and my over by 1 inch. And I'm just using that scrap as a guide, and voila, just cut that. So now I have my binding pieces just overlapping 1 inch. So I can get rid of all this stuff. And I'm actually going to take this out of my machine. Forgot about that. And now this is the trick. So I have my pieces. I'm going to unfold this one. And then I'm going to take these two pieces and place them right sides together. So this is the move. It's kind of a move. So you've got them both laying flat. Take this one and take this one and go like this. And then, so they're right sides together and I've kind of crossed them. And then I'm going to sew with my sewing machine from corner to corner. So from here to here. And if you're nervous about this, just put a pin in it and kind of mock your seam there. And then you can test it. And you'll see, woo, we're getting a nice clean seam there and it fits perfectly. This is such a cool technique. So I'm going to sew this now. And then I'll just finish sewing on my, my binding. Just getting these all lined up there though. This is kind of a small area. It's all right. So we sew it just like that. And then I'll just trim this seam allowance. And then I can just keep on sewing my binding. Just keep finishing that seam and it will be perfectly finished. I'm really happy with that. Looks good so far. All right, so at this point I am going to press my napkin. This is really the first time I've pressed it. And I'm going to press the binding over my raw seam, kind of avoiding the corners, but just getting this pressed really well. And then we will trim out our corners and get this top stitch down. So I'm going to keep on pressing here. So I have my binding kind of pressed in just a little bit. So things are starting to look quite nice. I'm very pleased with the way this one's turned out. So now I'm going to go into all of my corners with a really sharp pair of scissors and just trim as close to my stitching without cutting it as possible. And then just kind of trimming out a little bit of the bulk from each of the corners. I'm not going to trim any of the other seam allowance. If maybe I had a slightly less fabric that frayed a little bit less, maybe I would, but this fabric kind of ravels really easily. So I'm just going to stick with the corners. And I also haven't taken out my gathering threads yet. I leave them in until the end because I find that they add just a little bit of stability to the ruffle and kind of make working in this area as we top stitch our binding just a little bit easier. So I save it till the end. So our very last step is to top stitch our binding down. Actually, we're going to stitch it from the binding side, so not actually the right side. We're going to do it from the binding side. And I'll meet you at the machine because I'm going to show you how I do the corners to get the neatest possible miter. Okay, so I have my napkin binding side facing up, and I've just kind of placed it now, just starting to cover my raw edge there, or my seam. And I'm just going to start, about middle way on one of the sides. And I'm just going to stitch right along this folded edge here of my binding. And then once I get to the corner, I'll show you how we're going to take all of this bulk and make it nice and neat. Okay, so as I come into the corner, I'm going to set my machine to stop with the needle down to kind of finger press my binding flat as far as I can get it. So literally just almost kind of folding this edge of the binding out and getting it as like folded and flat there. And then I kind of flip this side over and lay it flat. And you should have a somewhat of a nice, neat miter there. And then you can pin this for sure, but I just kind of do my finger pressing, and I will stop with the needle down as I get, like right when I cross over onto this side of the binding, I stop with my needle down and I pivot. And I'll do the same thing on all of the corners, just kind of tucking some of these stray threads under my binding so it's nice and neat. Okay, so let's do another corner. So coming into my corner, kind of assessing it, seeing what I've got here, and just laying my binding all the way flat, all the way kind of opening up this binding, and then just folding this side of the binding over until it's nice and neat there, and then just holding it with my hands, and then I'll pivot right where the two meet in the corner and come down the other side. All right, so I've stitched down all of my binding, and I have nice, neat miters inside. And the very last step is to go and spend a little time with my seam ripper and remove the gathering stitches that I can see. So that outer row of gathering we're going to remove. And then my beautiful napkins will be done. I cannot get over how pretty these are. So I'd love to hear from you below what you thought of this tutorial. Are you going to make them? What color do you have in mind? And I'm kind of thinking of this tutorial as like part 1 of 3 or 4 kind of kitchen related tutorials, because I found this tablecloth at the market, and I am thinking about making not a valance, a Roman shade for my kitchen using this. So that's going to be one. And then I have a stack of some fabric-y things that I'm going to make pot holders and an oven mitt. So definitely hit the subscribe button for more, and you can shop my patterns, including this one. This is the new Van Dam top and dress that's actually coming out next week. But you can shop all of my patterns over at sewingandthecity.com. So thank you so much for watching. Hit the like button on your way out. It helps me so much as I grow my channel. And I'll see you next time. Bye.